Each year, hundreds of millions of people are affected by hunger. Among them are millions of refugees. Almost half of them are children, who, due to forced migration, are struggling to access the food they need to survive. Why? When violence breaks out, people might be injured or killed, and others are forced to flee, carrying very little or nothing with them. In times of war and conflict, farming the land is no longer a safe way to feed your family. Crops left behind in the fields and stored grain can become targets for those fighting. As people flee or hide, their movement is restricted and social networks break down. Support from friends and neighbors becomes difficult. Since widespread conflict disrupts daily life, people can't go to work or school anymore. The displaced can quickly run out of money to buy food. As more and more farms and livestock are abandoned, the food supply goes down, and the rare food that is available in local markets gets more and more expensive. Depending on the severity of violence, humanitarian aid can be blocked from getting to those who need it. The majority of people being forced to flee are on the move as a result of war and civil conflict and disasters caused by the changing climate. The ongoing loss of infrastructure and harm to the natural environment, the economy, and society have long-term destabilizing impacts on the whole food system. Constant hunger leads to high levels of malnutrition and illness, with long-lasting effects on the health of those affected, particularly women and children. Imagine if you were forced to flee for any reason. You would face difficult choices. You would struggle to provide for your most basic needs, including food. Find out what choices you would make in our Forced to Flee simulation. Take the experience, increase your empathy, and learn a little bit more about the world around you.
Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome. My name is Megan Silencieux, and I'll be your host and moderator for about the next hour. Shortly, I'm going to pop up a poll that will appear at the bottom of your screen, and if we have a moment, feel free to respond to those questions as you can. June 20th is World Refugee Day. This is an international day designated to honor refugees around the globe. Today, we're honoring and celebrating the strength and courage of people who have been forced to flee their homes, their communities, and countries to escape conflict or persecution. During this webinar, we hope to shine a light on the threats that war and conflict pose to food security. And we'll hear more about some of the ways in which the entirety of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank Network is working together to mobilize Canadians to pray, learn, and advocate, and to generate the political will to respond and to provide needed support and assistance so that refugees and internally displaced people and others forced to migrate from these fragile contexts can not only survive, but thrive. Also, later in this webinar, I'm excited to share that we're officially launching 2 really exciting new resources to help Canadians build their deeper awareness about these issues. There'll also be a place during our time together for panelists to respond to your questions a little bit later towards the bottom half of our time. So I'll encourage you, as these questions come up for you, to pop them into the chat or into the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Once we get there, if there are many, many questions, which would be really great, we may not be able to respond to all of them live, but we'll work to respond to any that we don't get to during the webinar via email afterwards. We intend to move pretty seamlessly throughout our speakers this evening. There are several, and we are really lucky to have so many guests sharing with us this evening. Throughout, our team will be sharing their bios and information about the speakers in the chat for you to read as they're speaking. First up is Miriam Harder, who's a Senior Program Officer here at the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. Over to you, Miriam.
So to start this evening, I want to situate our conversation with an overview of where people experiencing significant levels of hunger, with at least in part due to conflict, are in our world today. So this is a map from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and World Food Program for countries where people are currently experiencing acute food insecurity, with one of the key drivers being conflict, where the situation is expected to get worse within the next 6 months. So you'll see in the darkest blue, the spots of highest concern, which are in Palestine, South Sudan, Mali, Sudan, and Haiti. In the blue, you'll see spots of very high concern, which are Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Syria, and Yemen. And then hotspots in the turquoise, which are Lebanon, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So this is the context today and looking forward. I wanted to talk a little bit about what our programming has looked like in the last fiscal year with conflict-affected people. This is a summary table of our programming. In the last fiscal year, we supported projects responding to the needs of conflict-affected people in 13 different countries. Not all of the countries listed here are experiencing conflict themselves, but may be hosting refugees from other countries. In total, we funded 31 projects through 11 members and 25 of their partners. We respond in quite a variety of different ways to conflict-affected people experiencing food insecurity. This is a very basic chart of what that would look like. Providing food assistance is our most common response, and in fact, 70% of all of our food assistance programming is with people in contexts where conflict is the primary driver of food insecurity. Food assistance is provided in various forms, even within the same country, according to what makes sense in that particular context and for that particular partner that is responding, and for what is most helpful to the people that are in need of the assistance. So for example, in Lebanon, you'll see that assistance is provided via food parcels and food vouchers and cash assistance, which in a very small country is interesting, but they're all very localized, context-specific responses where these are the decisions that have been made. In-kind assistance, where actual food, which is typically purchased within the same country, is provided, is still the most common way of responding. In the last fiscal year, 62% of our food assistance programming was in-kind assistance. But cash and voucher assistance is very significant for us, representing 38% of our food assistance programming in the last fiscal year. We also support acute malnutrition treatment projects with partner organizations that specialize in this kind of programming in both Somalia and Haiti. And we provide livelihood support for things such as seeds and tools, livestock and trainings for people to recover and rebuild their livelihoods and lives. Over to you, Tanila.
So I'll be giving an overview of the key themes we'll be considering in this webinar. The broad scope of what I'll be covering would be basically giving a primer of the various themes we'll be discussing today. I would aim to give a bird's eye view of issues that our other speakers will be speaking to. I will try to show the linkages between conflict, food insecurity, and forced migration. I will point to some of the laws that guide food assistance, and I'll give some information on the situation in contexts such as Sudan and Gaza as it relates to hunger and displacement. Just to kind of get started, the drivers of hunger and food insecurity are tied to a combination of factors: protracted conflict, economic disruptions, and climate shocks. According to the Global Report on Food Crises 2024, the major driver of hunger and food insecurity in 2023 was conflict, with 70% of the world's hungry living in areas affected by war and violence. A significant impact of conflict is movement of persons away from said context. Migration can be understood in two ways, voluntary or forcible. The understanding of both is as implied. In situations where conflict is prevalent, forced migration is the major consequence. This means people leaving their homes, their sources of livelihood, wiping out sources of income, their access to food, and wrecking economies. People who are forced to flee fall into two major categories, internally displaced persons and refugees. Internally displaced persons are people who have fled their homes but remain within their country, whereas refugees are persons who flee their country to another country. By so doing, they cross international borders. With the number of protracted crises at a high, there has been a steady rise in the number of persons displaced and living as refugees. To put it in context, according to the Global Trends report put out by the UN Refugee Agency as at the end of 2023, 68.3 million people were internally displaced. This represents a 50% increase in the last 5 years. The refugee population stood at 43.4 million. This number has tripled in the last decade. Hunger is a persistent danger and threatens the lives of large numbers of forcibly displaced people and influences their decisions about when and where to move. During periods of conflict, hunger may be both a cause and a consequence of forced migration. People affected by conflict experience it not only as a threat to their lives, but as an attack on their livelihoods that can undermine their ability to produce to provide for their most basic needs, including food. Beyond conflict leading to forced migration, conflict has an impact on food systems, which has a knock-on effect on food security. When we talk about food systems, we mean all aspects of feeding and nutrition. This is growing, harvesting, packaging, processing, transporting, marketing, and consuming food. All the interactions between people and the natural world, land, water, and the climate, and the natural world's effect on human health and nutrition. Conflict can restrict people's movement and their access to markets, farmlands, and jobs. If they cannot produce the food they need to survive or earn an income to purchase that food, their nutritional well-being is compromised. It also leads to the destruction of agricultural assets, such as farms, livestock, gardens, land, and food stocks. Or it can disrupt markets and supply chains, especially for small-scale farmers, driving up prices and damaging livelihoods. Armed conflict remains an important cause of environmental damage, degradation, and deforestation, leading to not only food insecurity, but water resource depletion and biodiversity loss. The weapons of war leave environmental legacies. They can restrict access to agricultural land and cause pollution to the air, soil, and water sources with metals and toxic materials. Bombing and other methods of modern warfare directly harm wildlife. Additionally, as conflict displaces people, it causes people to settle in areas with limited natural resources. It is in this context that we respond. A question that comes to mind is, what do international laws say about food, food security, and conflicts? Some laws that speak to this are our international humanitarian law, otherwise known as the laws of war. This comprises a set of laws, notable of which are the Geneva Conventions. There are also principles which underpin these laws. While there is no direct provision in IHL for right to food, IHL complements human rights norms on the right to adequate food by setting conduct and prohibiting certain behavior to prevent lack of food or denial of access to food in situations of armed conflict. One of the basic principles is the principle of distinction. In war, warring parties should distinguish between civilian populations and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives. In this case, when we talk about civilian objects, we mean food, agricultural areas for the production of food, crops, livestock, drinking water installations and supplies, and irrigation work. Also, lack of food or denial of access to it, or causing a population to suffer hunger because of deprivation of food sources or supplies is prohibited. IHL also ensures humanitarian access. Humanitarian access concerns humanitarian actors' ability to reach populations affected by crises, as well as affected populations' ability to access humanitarian assistance and services. Access is a precondition to humanitarian action. For us, humanitarian action means food aid delivery and distribution. The responsibility of humanitarian access lies with warring parties. If they are unable to meet this obligation, they are required to allow and facilitate the provision of assistance. CFGB and our network are guided by the Code of Conduct for the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movements and non-governmental organizations in disaster relief. It's interpreted and applied in line with international humanitarian law. With this, CFGB safeguards high standards of behavior, independence, impartiality, neutrality, effectiveness. CFGB and by extension the network are a member of the Humanitarian Coalition and the Humanitarian Response Network. Another body of law that we can look at is international human rights law. The right to food is captured therein, most especially in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which says that everyone has a right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food. Additionally, it recognizes that steps need to be taken to ensure the fundamental right to freedom from hunger and malnutrition. Every state is obliged to ensure for everyone under its jurisdiction access to the minimum essential food, which is sufficient, nutritionally adequate, and safe to ensure their freedom from hunger. Another law that really guides the work we do is the Food Assistance Convention. The convention has the objectives of saving lives, reducing hunger, improving food security, and improving the nutritional status of the most vulnerable populations and addressing those needs. There are 14 signatories to this agreement, including Canada, the US, Australia, and the European Union. It can be argued that international humanitarian law and fundamental humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, as well as the principles and good practice of humanitarian donorship, are founding pillars for this international agreement. Signatories to the convention make a minimum pledge of their contribution to food assistance annually. Within the policy department, we strive to engage stakeholders in government to remind them consistently of their obligations under these laws, keeping them accountable and raising awareness of situations where these principles are not being followed. Having given an overview of the relationship between conflict, food insecurity, and forced migration, let's look at a couple of examples that you have seen in the news in recent months. Gaza, since the violence escalated in October 2023, more than 2 million Palestinians have been left without clean water, food, and critical medical care. As we have seen in the headlines, hunger levels are alarmingly high, and as of mid-March, famine is projected to occur by the end of May. There are 2.3 million people in acute food insecurity, and of which 1.1 million face famine. Access is highly restricted, and food aid delivery is difficult. The situation has also led to the collapse of local agri-food systems. In this situation, 1.7 million Palestinians, which is about 75% of the population in the Gaza Strip, have been displaced. Sudan. Internal violence erupted in April 2023. By the end of 2023, 9.1 million Sudanese people have been displaced, and 1.8 million fled to neighboring countries. The conflict has led to the destruction of markets and trade disruptions due to the lack of agricultural inputs. In Sudan, 17.7 million people are in acute food insecurity. To conclude, I'll give you some key takeaways. The first one is that conflict leads to food insecurity and drives forced migration, increasing the numbers of internally displaced persons and refugees. It has a knock-on effect on food systems and adversely impacts the environment and biodiversity. There are laws that guide food assistance and the right to food. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chanel, for that really great overview of everything. I think it'll feed really well into the case study that I have, which is of Gaza as well. My name is Annie Lowen. I am a programs manager with Mennonite Central Committee Canada, and I work with our humanitarian programming and with our CFGB funded humanitarian programming in the Middle East and other places as well. So MCC is an organization that works in over 47 countries. I think this is information from last year, but we've expanded it a little bit around the world. You'll see that on the map there. We program mainly through local partners in each of the contexts where we work. We do programming in all areas, relief development piece as well, education and health. But the topic today is, of course, conflict, hunger, and humanitarian access. So we'll focus on that. The theme of the webinar being what it is, and the work that I've been doing over the past number of months, Gaza is always top of mind for me. Yeah, and across all of the humanitarian programming and all of the contexts around the world that I've worked with MCC and over the past decade, the current situation in Gaza represents one of the most complex humanitarian working environments that I've ever encountered. It's important to note that many of the people living in Gaza, even prior to the current crisis, were refugees or descendants of refugees who were displaced from their homes in 1948. And a year later, in 1949, is when MCC first began working in Gaza and in the West Bank in response to the vulnerability of the refugee communities there. We still see the impacts of this displacement, even from 75 years ago, not just in Palestine, but in neighboring countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, where MCC continues to work with these Palestinian refugee communities in an ongoing way. So prior to October 7th, MCC was largely programming in the areas of education and food security programming, psychosocial support, and then during each bombardment that has happened over the past 20 years, we have also been providing food assistance. The current bombardment is unprecedented from what we have seen previously. Sometimes the bombardments would last for maybe 8 days, sometimes 50 days, but now we're heading into over 9 months of bombardment, and the scope of MCC's programming has shifted entirely. We're no longer doing any type of livelihoods programming that we would have previously been doing prior to October 7th. You'll see in the photo on the screen right now, this is one of our local partner training facilities for vocational training for electricians and plumbers. This was taken shortly after the bombing started in October, but this is also representative of what all three of our local partners in Gaza have experienced over the past number of months. So as Chanello said, currently there are approximately 2.2 million people in Gaza, with 75% of the population being displaced from their homes, and nearly all of them are in need of humanitarian assistance. Almost 60% of the farmland in Gaza has been destroyed and is not usable. Approximately half the population is approaching catastrophic levels of food insecurity and famine. Over 30% of children are suffering from severe malnutrition. And all of this has happened in the last 9 months. And it has been forecasted for months prior to that, as Chanel mentioned, by food monitoring agencies. And as much as it is predictable, it is also very preventable. Famine is not caused by a lack of food availability, but access to food. So in context for MCC, we currently have 4,000 boxes of food waiting in a warehouse in Jordan that are not currently able to be delivered into Gaza. The constraints that MCC and all other humanitarian organizations currently working to deliver assistance into Gaza are facing, these are administrative and logistical barriers that prevent us from being able to access people in need. MCC is currently working with our three local partners in Gaza, our partner Al Naj Development Forum, which you'll see in the picture on the screen, is our partner who is currently working on delivering food assistance programming that's funded through Canadian Foodgrains Bank with funding from the Humanitarian Coalition. And these are funds that have been provided through the matching funds for Gaza through the Canadian government. In March, we were able to deliver food assistance to 550 households in Deir al-Balah, which is in the middle area of Gaza. But since that time, the southern areas of Gaza have been under bombardment, with crossings into Gaza in the south all being closed or inaccessible. Currently, only one crossing is functional in Gaza, and that's Erez in the north of Gaza. However, significant bombing that's been ongoing since October means that the roads there are not functional and that there is no safe way to navigate from the north of Gaza into the central areas where our MCC partners are located. There's also less fuel available in Gaza every day. There's less and less, which makes hiring transport trucks incredibly difficult. Many warehouses that were previously used by humanitarian organizations to store assistance items have been bombed and destroyed. Many humanitarian agencies have been reporting that their local offices and warehouses have been destroyed, and trucks carrying humanitarian aid and humanitarian workers have been bombed in the past number of months. And as the food situation in Gaza becomes more and more desperate, we're also more aware of safety concerns for our partner staff and transport drivers in moving and distributing in situations where people are more and more desperate for the assistance that they need, simply because they want to be able to feed their families, but it does pose safety risks for our staff as well. While our local partners are amazing and committed to doing as much as they can with the dwindling resources that are available inside Gaza, they are also exhausted. Some staff have now been displaced 6 times in the last 9 months. They are living in tents alongside the over 1 million other displaced people in Gaza. The living conditions are horrible. There is lack of running water, no sanitation services, no reliable electricity. And there have been many times over the past 9 months where we've waited days to hear from our local partners and have worried about their safety. Because of communication lines that have been shut down, or communication networks that have been totally blocked out. MCC is continuing to provide as much support as we can to our local partners. We are continuing to work at procuring what we can locally within Gaza to distribute to people in need. There are some supplies that are available, but not very much. We are also constantly trying to navigate the complex humanitarian situation to try to connect with other organizations and find out how to get our assistance that is waiting into the country or into Gaza as soon as possible. But even we anticipate as MCC that even as the needs continue to grow, and even as you know, if the prospect of the current conflict ending comes up, we anticipate that we'll be responding to the humanitarian needs in Gaza for years to come. So it will shape what we do and what we have been doing for the next decade, at least, I'm sure, if not longer than that, along with many other humanitarian organizations that are responding. But yeah, that's it feels like a heavy situation a lot of times. There's a quote from a lawyer, a Palestinian lawyer that previously worked for MCC, and he said that the situation is it feels dreadful, but it is not without hope. So we like to cling to that as a reminder of the work that we're doing and the work that we are trying to accomplish through our local partners. But we appreciate all of the support from folks like those listening on the call who care and who are willing to listen and to do what they can. Thanks, everyone.
I think everyone can hear me now. It's good that there was a brief introduction on the conflict on Sudan, because it seems that Sudan is moving to become another forgotten crisis, despite the heavy toll the conflict has had on the populations, as well as the severity and the dire needs that there are there. So the situation in Sudan, as you can see from the numbers, even prior to the current conflict that started in April 15th, 2023, the situation had been very dire. Prior to the conflict, there were already 3 million displaced between 2010 to 2019, and food security projections showed that out of the 18 million, even prior to the conflict, around that are under IPC3, around 40% will go under IPC4. So I don't know, I think everyone has heard of the conflict that started in April 2023 between the RSF, or the Rapid Response Forces, and the Sudanese army, and has had a heavy toll on the populations, especially in Darfur and Khartoum. Currently, Sudan has the highest number of displacement globally, with 10 million individuals displaced, over 55% of which are children. There's 2.1 million have been displaced externally, mainly to Chad, Egypt, and South Sudan. There has been several conferences, and there has been calls that there is an encroaching famine, especially as we approach the lean season in the country. What you see here is a map with all the dark areas are where the famine is expected to be. All are IPC4, which are emergency needs. So I'm not going to state all the numbers here, but you can see them here. So ADRA Sudan. ADRA started in Sudan in 1979. We have been working in different states in Sudan. We mainly work in WASH, food security, protection, health and nutrition, and literacy and education. Currently, we have projects in 4 locations. Previously, we had an office in Khartoum, which was looted in May last year when the Rapid Response Forces, entered Khartoum. So we have programming in West Darfur, White Nile, and Damazin. We work mainly through our national staff. We have amazing national staff. We also work with grassroots or local partners. We work hand in hand and together. So yeah. So the situation, as it's interesting to see different contexts such as Gaza, the situation in Sudan is also quite complex. And like I mentioned, it's a protracted crisis that is also quite acute, and an emergency situation that's coming on top of a protracted crisis. So I'm just going to give you an example. pre-conflict, Address Sudan's funding was already moving towards resilience and development programming. Although I don't like to categorize both, but we were already starting to think forward in how we can build the nexus approach. Post-conflict, we are now, our resilience funding has decreased. Meanwhile, the emergency funding has increased. However, I mean, the story that I would like to pose here is that development is still needed, even in humanitarian contexts, and especially in displacement contexts. So we'll have an example. This is Address Sudan's portfolio, our main donors, which you can see CFGBs there. And this is why we were very grateful for CFGB, among other donors and stakeholders. It's because they actually listened and had faith in the fact that even in an emergency, we still need to continue with the resilience programming, depending on the context. And what we're doing right now is we're seeing areas with relative stability where we're actually working through agriculture and livelihood programming, as well as MPCA programs. So let me just give you an overview of our food security programming, especially for IDPs. So Address Sudan, we like to promote market-based approaches, because we do feel that it has elements of nexus that can help us in rebuilding, but also we found that it even lessens the strain on the community, because when you inject money to the market, and this we've seen more than once, especially in our West Darfur programming, when you inject money to the market, the vendors tend to employ more workers, and those workers are often IDPs, decreasing the need or the humanitarian aid caseload. So since the outbreak of conflict, we've been serving around 36,300 individuals in Khartoum, White Nile, Blue Nile, and Al Jazeera. This has been funded by BHA USAID, DANIDA, and Sudan Humanitarian Funding. So basically, our cash transferred last year nearly equaled $3.4 million US dollars. And then, like I mentioned, we are strong advocates for cash-based assistance, because we do feel that it kind of lessens the strains and the tensions between the host community and the IDP populations. We've done that in the past, because we've also done refugee programming in Sudan, and we found this to be a very good mechanism in how we can also indirectly benefit the host community. Obviously, we also do a lot of research. We do a lot of market assessments just to kind of understand the dynamics that go into MPCA. How is it impacting the markets? What inflation is happening, and so on. So we're part of the National Joint Monitoring Initiative in Sudan to analyze this and share it among stakeholders. And then let us go to the food security programming, which is also funded by CFGB in Blue Nile and White Nile. So we do also provide, provide seeds, especially improved seeds in locations where we found that there's some relative stability and where IDPs could also be engaged. We link them to financial service providers. We do financial literacy, and I mean the numbers are there. But the story that I need to tell is that we should not stop when during conflict to push for when and where possible development programming, because from what we saw, especially this year's FAO report in Sudan, was that one of the things that really saved the food security and the yields was the fact that there were lots of IDPs that were engaged in farming, that actually lessened the hit on the overall food production, especially cereal production, which already decreased by 40%. However, this could have been way more severe had there not been an engagement of the IDP populations in that labor and harvest. Some pictures from our beautiful ladies in Blue Nile. And then some of our strategies. So first of all, we do in the future would like to increase our cash-based responses, again, to invigorate the local markets, but also it's important that IDPs and refugees still have the dignity to select the things they need, what they feel they need best. And it's also very important to understand, because of the complexity of the current situation. I always give this example, is that when you compare an IDP coming from the capital of Khartoum to an IDP coming, let's say, from a rural area of Blue Nile, it's like comparing an IDP that's coming from Ukraine to an IDP coming from a rural area, let's say in Yemen. They have different needs, they have different wants. And the only way that we can meet that is through cash intervention and giving them that ability to choose what suits them best. We also have like agriculture advisory as part of our objectives, innovations, and strengthening the seed system, localization, which is very important to us, engagement of youth and females. There are some difficulties here, which I'll explain the next slide, and climate change integration, because although right now what we see is like conflict-driven displacement, but previously there was also climate-related displacement and a search for resources, especially in areas with high drought. And it's also one of our priorities right now is to see what the IDPs could bring in those situations. And something that I've always been hopeful about is that right now in Sudan, what's happening is that there are lots of IDPs coming from Khartoum. And those IDPs are settling in those rural areas, and they bring an additional skill set. For instance, we've had some IDPs coming with more information on solar panels. They're highly educated, especially females, and they've been able to champion and influence other females within those rural areas. And despite, the fact that it is a tragedy, this displacement, but we need to also look for opportunities, look for ways where we can engage those IDPs, again, especially youth and females. Some of the challenges we're facing is connectivity, both for the staff and beneficiaries. There were 2 months, and I was in Sudan, 2 months where we couldn't call anyone. All phone lines were down across Sudan. The only internet we had was Starlink, which is right now also dropped from Sudan. And then we have the issues with liquidity, access to financial service providers, fuel supply. The fact that mobile money is quite exclusive because you have to have a smartphone, which might not be accessible to everyone, especially females and highly vulnerable populations. Access to land and opportunities for women and youth. It's a very complex issue in Sudan because land is power, and it's a very tribal issue. So females do not have the right to own land in Sudan, according to the cultural laws and the tribal laws. And land has been a source of conflict between different tribes. So that is something that we're working through the value chains to see where how we can address transportation costs and so on, as well as working with local stakeholders and government entities, because many of those workers have not received salaries and are no longer functional or working. I think that's it. But yeah, I hope, I pray that the situation in Sudan resolves itself, because I think the Sudanese deserve so much better. Thank you.
Good evening, good day, everyone. Now we're going to travel back to Africa, and in North Kivu of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a most beautiful place, and yet people suffer a lot of injustice and suffering amongst a country that has great wealth and a lot of grit amongst its people. DR Congo is centered in Africa and has nearly 100 million people. It's the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa and the size of Western Europe. They have exceptional natural resources that include natural resources, as well as minerals, as well as hydropower. And yet most of the Congolese people have not been able to benefit from this wealth. The injustice in the Democratic Republic of Congo has lasted over the last 140 years and started with political upheaval and extreme violence that started with the Belgian occupation. It is an ongoing humanitarian crisis and often neglected, and often we don't hear about it in this part of the world. I normally live in Nairobi in Kenya, and there we get quite a bit more news about the DR Congo, because some of the refugees do also come to Kenya, as they do to Canada. DR Congo, as a global player, is amongst the 5th poorest nations in the world, and yet it's one of the most wealthiest. It has very high stunting rates amongst its children, 87% malnutrition, leading to the stunting that is both physical but also mental. I was told a story recently by one of our Congolese colleagues. He said, for $10,000, any internal or external buyer can buy an army and a mine. And that's why in North Kivu, we have 134 different militia groups, each of them operating with a mine that is supplying either a local or foreign master somewhere, and an army to keep other people at bay or competing forces at bay. So what do guinea pigs and church leaders have to do with this? You see this guinea pigs on the left in the photo. What happens is, tragically, is that when militia groups come to the villages to raid so that they can bring food back to their mining area, they don't bother with the small stock like rabbits and guinea pigs. And so many people prefer to have guinea pigs for protein as a protein source for the family, rather than cows or goats, which will be stolen by the militia groups. Church leaders negotiate with the militia groups, especially in areas where we are programming. They will ask the militia groups to please leave these farmers alone for at least 3 years so that they can continue with the project. It is unbelievable, the kind of negotiating that has to happen. And so what happens is, church leaders too, when they are in their seminary studies, learn how to raise guinea pigs and rabbits for the sake of their own families, but also for the sake of the community, so that they can support them with highly needed protein needs. In North Kivu, we are in solidarity with the people by partnering with the Baptist Church in Northeast Congo. We do this together with Canadian Baptist Ministries, ourselves, Tier Fund Canada, and the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. The CBCA, which is a short form for the Baptist Church, is large and has large influence. It has over 450,000 members in this part of the world, and has many schools, 608 schools, and almost 160 medical facilities. And so they have a large presence in North and South Kivu. Some of the work that our partner does with our support is also to look at sexual and gender-based violence trauma healing. How do we help people through that trauma? Because sexual violence is used as a weapon of war. As a result, babies are born. They're called war babies, and they're often neglected. And so the church helps to get them birth certificates so that they too may go to school. There's other work that's happening in this area on regenerative agriculture, village savings and loans. We're working with about 5,000 households in this insecure area. What's amazing is that village savings and loans groups such as this embrace refugees like Rachel. She's an internally displaced person. Her village was destroyed by one of the militia groups, but she was embraced by one of the village savings and loans group and became a member there. She told us that is her new family because her own family was killed by the militia when her village was destroyed. War also destroys land. A lot of destruction on this very hilly terrain where vegetation should retain on the hills so that we don't lose soils. And through the programming, we know that in our areas, there is no more burn. And we cover most of the soils. And yet when the militias come through, this can be destroyed in a moment. Farmers are brave. They farm the land, they bring in mulch, they do their best, not knowing whether the day that they're on the field is a day when they'll reach home. One of our staff said, security in North Kivu is like the weather. It could be sunshine in the morning, but thunderstorms at noon. And so continually have to monitor the security situation. And yet people continue to care for the land, to try and retain the soil, to try and grow food for their small stock and for their families. The weather is perfect. When I'm there, it feels like a Garden of Eden. There are streams everywhere. It is a most gorgeous tropical paradise. Anything grows. Here's our team. On the very right at the bottom is Jeanette. She is a very brave team leader. She ensures that this entire team of 19 people continues to work effectively amongst the people who have to continually be on guard for their safety. In the center is Polisi, who is the Canadian Baptist Ministry's local representative. He is able to be on the ground when often we are not able to be on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody who has put, all the presenters have put into perspective the issue of refugees and displaced persons. So my name is Pamela Obonde. I'm on staff at the Foodgrains Bank as the International Learning Coordinator. Today on World Refugee Day, we've been learning about the situation of people in crisis. People who face tremendous hardships and have to make difficult choices. I'm pleased to share with you two new tools that we have developed to help you engage with your friends, families, colleagues, and church communities in a deeper conversation and learning about forced migration and the challenges it poses to food security. Many of you may already be familiar with the existing Forced to Flee resource that was developed several years ago and is currently being used in churches and classrooms across Canada. Like all other versions of Forced to Flee, the objective of this resource is to transform our thinking about the experiences of people who are forced to flee their homes and to inspire action around conflict, migration, and refugees. Next. So today in this webinar, we are officially launching two new adaptations of Forced to Flee. The first one is an online version of the simulation found at forcedtoflee.ca. It can be done in a shorter time than the original resource. It can also be done by an individual or even in a small group. It functions as a self-experience, and users read through each scenario carefully. They reflect on their choices, and then they make difficult decisions about how to proceed. The second tool we are launching today is Forced to Flee, adapted for the online platform Kahoot, which many of you have likely used in some form of online learning already. This version is ideal for really large audiences, and it provides an interactive plenary experience of the simulation. So I'm going to take a few more minutes now to give you a peek at each of these new tools. So if you make your way to forcedtoflee.ca, you'll see that the homepage includes the video that we viewed at the beginning of this webinar. There are links to learn about the objective of Forced to Flee, as well as a glossary of terms used throughout the simulation that is accessible throughout the resource. This resource is free and ready to use. After you click the Start the Journey button, the one in yellow, you will be asked to enter some basic information. There are 4 location scenarios that you must read and make a decision about what to do next. On the top right, you see a leaderboard that shows you how many food, health, and money points you have at any given time. You are then presented with choices. After you pick your choice, you'll be shown the cost of your decision. These point values automatically adjust each step on the journey. Next. For every location choice made, consequences and next steps are revealed. Sometimes there are surprises and unexpected consequences for your choices as you progress through the simulation. There are also periodic pop-ups that include a random outcome via a digital coin toss to determine, for example, whether or not emergency food aid is provided to you or what happens next for your family. Once complete, there are links to some of the companion resources to Forced to Flee. There are also pathways to dig deeper into our 4 calls to action. That is to pray, to give, to learn, or to advocate. You also have the option to try the simulation again and see if you arrive at a better outcome. At the bottom, you can see there are social media links that allow users to create a post on their desired platform or share about the experience and challenge others to try it themselves. You can also use the social media links to spread the word. And now let's move to Kahoot, which is an interactive version. As I mentioned earlier, this is ideal for use with groups of 50 people and over. You could use this with your whole congregation or at a school assembly, or even at a youth or young adult gathering. It's completely scripted. It requires very little preparation and is designed to be as simple as possible to use. So the Kahoot version includes 4 rounds of small group discussion. The small group here act as a family unit. The members here are to make decisions and thereafter weigh in on their smartphones. Participants are encouraged to think about who is in their family and to discuss and make decisions from the point of view of each family member, who each have their own unique perceived needs, abilities, and voices. As in the original version, the goal of your family or small group in this case is to make it to the end of the simulation with as many food, health, and money resources as possible. This new tool also includes some introductory content slides that help participants grow their awareness about refugees, internally displaced people, and forced migrants, as well as the specific ways that war and conflict make it hard for people to access the food that they need. The 4 location scenarios follow the same order as all other versions of Forced to Flee. The facilitator presents each scenario in the plenary, and then the small groups have 2 minutes to discuss amongst themselves, then come back and vote with their phones. Following each round of voting, the facilitator walks the audience through the consequences of all the 3 choices, and teams keep track of any points they gained or lost for every round. Same as the online version, there are a few random outcomes for the family units determined by a coin toss. And so the most significant updates in these two new versions are that the additional final chapters for the family unit, which go a bit further than the original resource, allowing you to see beyond your arrival at a refugee camp. The simulation closes with a few interactive reflection questions that anyone in the audience can respond to. This presents in the form of dynamic word clouds that generate in real time as the participants are answering on their phones. It helps to show what people felt about the experience, to help on other possible outcomes, and imagine what the future holds for their family. Included in the facilitator's guide are suggestions on creating immediate where to from here opportunities that can be done immediately following the simulation. We are hoping to get as many people as possible involved in sharing this resource. To this end, we are planning to do a series of trainings to help you bring Forced to Flee to your church, to your school, or even your workplace. So if you are interested in learning how to facilitate Forced to Flee, we have a virtual training, which is free. It's coming up scheduled for Thursday, July the 18th. And you are invited to register online via the event page on our website. But if being a facilitator at a large public event isn't within your realm of comfort, you can always contact us directly, and we could book a staff person to attend your event. So I'm looking forward to hearing back from you for either to be trained or to invite us out to your event, or simply your thoughts on how you think about this new online version. So for all your communications regarding this resource or to book a speaker, you can email us at forcedtoflee@foodgrainsbank.ca. So to bring our time to a close, I would invite us to bring our hearts and our minds together as you join me in praying for the situation of the millions of people around the world, people who have been forced to flee from their homes. This prayer comes from a worship resource for World Refugee Day called Welcoming the Stranger. Let us pray together. Compassionate One, we are surrounded by the needs of your people, and we are overwhelmed by their suffering. Have mercy on us, we pray. Touch our hearts. Help us to stand with your suffering children and to advocate their needs to those who do not recognize their suffering. Open our eyes anew, that we might know them as brothers and sisters, and be glad for the richness they bring us. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you very much.
I just wonder, I know we're just about a little bit over time. Could I ask all of our speakers and panelists to just put yourself back on camera just for 1 second before we go? I want to thank you just for joining us for tonight, or this afternoon, this evening. I know people are joining us from different time zones, but especially for Mesa, who's joining us in the middle of the night. in Jordan. So thank you for being here with us at that time when it's convenient for Canadians to hear you. We're really appreciative, and to know that you are amplifying stories of partners who are working in contexts that are quite difficult. And yeah, there's stories behind the stories that we've shared tonight. So just thank you for being here in this time, in this moment, to share those pieces. And thanks to everyone who's been listening in this call. We'll be communicating with you in the coming days just to let you know a little bit more information about what we've been speaking about tonight, certainly the training opportunities related to this resource, and as well as access to a recording of the evening. So I thought we could sign off together. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great evening, great day, great morning, wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.